Last year's Homeland Threat Assessment, DHS stated that domestic violent extremism, specifically white supremacist extremists, are the most persistent and lethal homeland security threat. That is a finding that both myself and Ranking Member Portman have been saying for some time now. And it's clear that this threat is real, and it's clear that we need to combat it. So my question to you is, beyond establishing the domestic terrorism branch, which is certainly, I think we all agree, a step in the right direction, are there other changes to INA's organization or authorities that you believe would help them address this threat?
It's my view that INA has the requisite authorities to address this threat if it prioritizes that threat. And in the last administration, it's my understanding that domestic terrorism was not considered a priority for INA. In fact, that the INA leadership kind of deferred to the FBI on that. So I think the authority exists. It's a focus on what the outcome is INA is trying to achieve and how they do that consistent with privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties going forward.
So your testimony is that it just was not prioritized. They have the authorities to do it. Perhaps we drill down on that a little bit, if we could, General. What do you see as the added value that INA provides to the broader federal intelligence community and partners in combating this? What is the specific value that they could bring if sufficiently prioritized?
Yeah, much of the work against violent extremists occurs in the 18,000 police departments across our country. Local law enforcement confronts these individuals, investigates these folks because they're committing acts in communities that those officers are sworn to protect. It's my view that through the fusion centers, INA and its intelligence officers can bring better perspective to the national level of what these 18,000 police organizations are seeing trend-wise and tactics, techniques, and procedure-wise in their communities. The FBI plays an extraordinarily important role in its JTTF, but as Director Wray has testified, there needs to be a definitive act of violence for the FBI to get involved. And I think that's the gap that INA can help cover with its collection and production in the field.
Very good. Ms. Patel, the next question is for you. As INA continues to attempt to better understand and analyze the real threat posed by domestic terrorism, could you share with the committee some of the concerns that communities of color in particular are facing with this effort to combat domestic terrorism?
Sure. Thank you for that question. So for communities of color, when you have broad open intelligence gathering, authorities and programs, there is a risk that they will be the targets of those programs. And we've seen this sort of systematically over the last 2 decades, where Muslim Americans have been targeted for surveillance, often on the basis of nothing other than their religion. We've seen this with African American communities being targeted. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement being targeted. And this is, a pretty well-known phenomenon in the United States. So I think the overall concern is that domestic terrorism is discussed sort of almost as a stand-in for white supremacist violence, but covers a much broader range of issues, as we've seen from DHS and FBI documents. So the concern is that these kinds of broad open surveillance programs will actually be used to target communities of color, as has been the case in the past.
Very good. General Taylor, last year you authored an op-ed noting your significant concern with INA's reportedly problematic intelligence operations in Portland and the publishing of intelligence on journalists specifically. More recently, this committee has found that INA warned generally about the potential for election-related violence, but failed to issue a warning specific to the risk facing the Capitol on January 6th. In both examples, INA clearly did not serve its customers or the American people in that respect. So my question to you is, in your opinion, what are the key reasons for INA's failures over this past year?
It's hard for me, Senator, to kind of focus in on the key reasons for failure because I wasn't in the decision cycle. But I think organizations like INA fail to meet their mission if they're not organized in a way that ensures consistency of production, consistency of focus. And it's my understanding that those processes and procedures that at least existed when I was there were no longer being used from an execution point of view. So I think solid leadership and solid management will save the day. By the way, I'm a product of the Church Commission and the follow-on from COUNTERINTELPRO. I've been on the Privacy and Civil Rights, Privacy and Civil Liberties Commission for President Bush. This is privacy and civil rights and civil liberties are fundamental to how we should think about domestic intelligence, and for whatever reason, that was not the case during the last year.
So when you talk about stability and continuity, I would assume the fact that we've had a lack of stability when it comes to INA leadership over the years, that has contributed to the problem that you see?
I do. As you mentioned in your opening statement, 12 different INA leaders over 19 years really does not give you a lot of confidence about continuity. And during my tenure, as has been my experience in the military, is when you take over an organization, you try to organize it to focus on the mission. Much of what we put in place was dismantled after we left office in 2017.
Thank you, General. As we start wrapping up here, I have one more question here, and actually for Mr. Sena. We've talked a great deal here at this hearing about the unique aspect of INA and how they share information with state, local, tribal, territorial governments. And with your work with fusion centers, of course, is the center of all of that. And you mentioned in your opening testimony that you had some specific actions that you would recommend to strengthen the sharing of relevant, timely, actionable intelligence information across those centers. If you could share with the committee some of those actionable ideas that we should consider.
Absolutely. One of the biggest pieces is that lack of the personnel resources that are on the ground, whether it's intelligence officers, collections managers, reports officers. We've got to have people in the local area, in the local regions across the country that have the capacity to share information in real time and to work closely with the FBI Field Intelligence Group and the Joint Terrorism Task Force and in that Fusion Center co-located environment. We need technology. Right now, the Homeland Security Information Network is riding on technology that is, in some cases, 18 years old. We need that capacity to have tools and resources that are easily accessible by all of our leaders out there, not just the folks in the fusion centers, but all of our partners. We also need folks that are on the ground to help support that privacy, the civil rights, the civil liberties training. And INA can play a pivotal role in that capability. And we also need that capacity to have personnel on the ground that when we run into, whether it's bureaucratic or whatever the hurdles may be, the fact that we have centers right now that can't get the critical data they need to prevent terrorist acts, to prevent major criminal threats, it's abysmal. And it's, here we are almost 20 years later, and we don't have that capacity. So having advocates there, I often say that I get more done by having a DHS regional director 3 doors down from me than I do with many of the calls that we have with Washington, D.C., because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where things get done. It's done at the local level because that's where the threats are. So I see that formation of INA pivoting what has happened over the last number of years, where the focus has been not as much on the state, local, and tribal territorial partners who are at the local level and looking at more of a larger intelligence community framework. There are lots of folks in the intelligence community that do a great job within their avenues of what they do. But the real strength of DHS INA is with their state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. It really is, because that's where the information's at. That's where the threat is. That's where we're dealing with the opioid and overdose epidemics. That's where we're dealing with transnational criminal organizations. That's where we're dealing with domestic violent extremists and every other violent extremist. And having the personnel there, we can't do this with a little over 100 people. We've got to have more folks in the field. And I agree, the mission center idea is great, but it needs to incorporate those state, local, tribal, territorial partners to be effective. And INA, in their unique role, has the ability to be our champion for that state, local, tribal, territorial community. And I think that's where they need to be uplifted too, but they need the resources from Congress to make sure that they have the capacity to achieve what they should be and what they were designed to be after September 11th. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And thank you again to all of our witnesses here today for giving us your time and your expertise this morning. This hearing is a part of our committee's bipartisan effort to examine the security and intelligence failures on January 6th, as well as to identify what reforms are needed to address the rising threat of domestic terrorism generally across the country. Our witnesses today focused on the importance of INA and how it needs to provide DHS and its partners, state and local governments, law enforcement, and the private sector with more actionable intelligence. We also discussed the unique position of INA as a domestic-focused intelligence agency and the need to ensure that we protect the privacy, the civil rights, and the civil liberties as they work to execute their mission. I certainly look forward to working with my colleagues as we continue to examine how to combat the rise of domestic terrorism, including white nationalism and anti-government violence. And certainly INA is the member of the intelligence community that is uniquely situated and suited to interact with both state and local enforcement, focus on strategic issues rather than specific law enforcement investigations, and leverage its existing domestic authorities to help us address that threat. So with that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until June 2nd at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.